Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about vegetable oils, which are probably better called industrial seed oils. And we're going to be answering the question of, are seed oils heart healthy and good for you? Or are they actually a driver of the epidemic of obesity, a chronic disease that we're seeing in Western countries in recent decades? Let's get into it. Our story first starts with previously unpublished data and the demonization of saturated fat. The gold standard of health studies are what are called randomized controlled trials. In a randomized controlled trial, one group in the experiment consumes a standard control diet, called the control group, and another consumes a diet that, in this case, is either higher or lower in saturated fat, called the intervention group. The study tries to keep all other factors the same and randomizes participants between the groups, and then compares the outcomes of the two groups to see if the intervention improved or worsened the group's health compared to the control. In a meta-analysis, the authors look through all of the previous studies, filter out the poor quality studies, and then analyse the data from all the highest quality studies together. And these are regarded as the top tier of evidence for health studies and can prove causation between increasing or decreasing saturated fat consumption and various diseases. It's important that you can prove causation and not just correlation, as many things that are unrelated or not directly related can be correlated, like margarine consumption and the divorce rate in Maine. Now, of course, if someone eats some margarine, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to get divorced. There's no causation there, only a correlation. And the same logic applies to studies on health. You need to establish a causation and not just a correlation, and understand the mechanism behind it. Let's look at some of these meta-analyses. There are multiple modern meta-analyses looking at the replacement of saturated fat with omega-6 from vegetable oil. Christopher Ramsden at the NIH and his co-authors have performed two such studies, as well as another by Stephen Hamley. Ramsden's group re-evaluated data from two randomized controlled trials that had not been fully published at the time, the Sydney Diet Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. Participants in the intervention group of the Sydney Diet Heart Study substituted animal fats, oils and margarines in their diet for safflower oil, containing 75% of the omega-6 polyunsaturated fat called linoleic acid, and no omega-3, and were instructed to increase their linoleic acid intake to about 15% of daily calories, and reduce their saturated fat intake to below 10% of calories. However, the study showed that substituting omega-6 linoleic acid in place of saturated fat did not provide the intended benefits, but instead actually increased all-cause mortality, cardiovascular death, and death from coronary heart disease, a worrying finding. The Minnesota Coronary Experiment is regarded as one of the most rigorously executed dietary trials of the replacement of saturated fat with vegetable oils rich in omega-6. In the trial, patients in nursing homes and mental hospitals were enrolled, where their diet could be precisely controlled. Those in the intervention group consumed corn oil in place of animal and hydrogenated fats, greatly increasing their omega-6 linoleic acid intake and reducing their saturated and trans fat intake compared to the control group. However, the study also found that replacing saturated fat with linoleic acid did not improve survival and actually increased the likelihood of death, particularly in older participants. In their meta-analysis looking at multiple randomized controlled trials, they found similarly that there was no benefit from replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils on mortality, and possibly a negative effect. And they concluded that incomplete publication has contributed to overestimation of benefits and underestimation of potential risks. Stephen Hamley in his meta-analysis concluded similarly that available evidence from adequately controlled randomized controlled trials suggests that replacing saturated fat with mostly linoleic acid is unlikely to reduce coronary heart disease or all-cause mortality. And he states that the reason that some studies have found benefit are because the trials were poorly controlled. So if you put garbage experimental data in, you'll get garbage results out. And so saturated fat has been exonerated in the past decade or so, after many decades of claims that it causes heart disease, despite this causation never being proven. Now, the advice that came as a result from demonizing saturated fat was to replace saturated fat consumption either with carbohydrates or polyunsaturated fat, since if you remove something from your diet, you have to replace it with something else. One of the results of this was to decrease consumption of fatty meats, eggs, animal fat, and other foods high in saturated fat and cholesterol, and increase consumption of carbohydrates and polyunsaturated fat, which is mostly found in seed or vegetable oils. But chronic diet and lifestyle related diseases like obesity, insulin resistance, diabetes, age-related macular degeneration, autoimmune diseases, cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases like dementia have also been increasing for decades. Looking at the data, we can see that obesity rates have been rising rapidly for decades across many countries, particularly Western countries like the UK and US. In 1975, the obesity rate in the US was 12%, and this had soared up to 37% by 2016, and is even higher today at 42%. The calories we have been eating have also increased. Looking at the US data, the daily calories increased from 3,050 in 1961 to around 3,850 in 2020. The increase in calories seems to have mostly come from an increase in oil and fat consumption, along with smaller increases in meat, cereals and grains, and fruits and vegetables. Surprisingly, with sugar consumption remaining similar, as sugar consumption was already high by 1961. In the UK, the increase in calories is actually much smaller across the same time period, with only about 200 calories increase. And most of these food groups remained roughly constant across the 60 years, and the main increase being in cereals and grains, with consumption of sugar actually going down. But the UK still follows the same obesity trend as the US, despite a much smaller increase in daily calories consumed and a decrease in sugar consumption. Although some of this decrease could be due to a use of artificial sweeteners, which may themselves actually contribute to metabolic syndrome and obesity. If we look more closely at the data for all of North America across this period, we can see that consumption of red meats like beef and lamb has slightly fallen. Sugar consumption has remained similar, fruit and grain consumption have increased, pork and poultry consumption have significantly increased, with poultry consumption more than tripling, but the largest difference is in the fats consumed. Animal fat consumption has halved, with vegetable oil consumption more than doubling in this period, from around 250 calories to around 560 calories, replacing animal fat. Looking further back to 1909 at the US data, we can see that the consumption of animal fats has fallen significantly, and there has been a huge increase in vegetable-based fats, which includes both vegetable oils and hydrogenated fats like shortening and margarine. These vegetable fats were mostly hydrogenated fats and margarines in the early 1900s, until vegetable oil consumption also took off in the 1960s. Together, the increase in vegetable fat has led to a large increase in polyunsaturated fat in the past 115 years. And if we compare this to groups eating a more traditional ancestral diet, like the Maasai in Tanzania, who consume all their calories from meat, blood, and milk, chronic disease like obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and other diseases are said to be very rare or absent. And this also applies to other groups who consume more plant-based carbohydrates and less animal fat and protein. It has also been observed that members of tribes originally living a traditional lifestyle, who then transitioned to a Western diet and lifestyle, were seen to develop the same health problems as are prevalent in Western countries. This means that there must be at least one or more factors about the Western diet and lifestyle that is causing this decline in health. And so the question remains, what is different between the Western diet and lifestyle and that of more traditional humans that might be making us sick? One of the obvious differences is a more sedentary lifestyle for many, due to transportation and machines replacing manual labour, leading to people needing to do less exercise. But there is also large differences in the diet as well. Typical Western diets include high amounts of processed foods, containing refined sugars, refined grains, and refined oils, foods that are absent for those eating a traditional diet. There may also be other factors at play, like reduced time outside leading to reduced sun exposure, or factors like mental stress, reduced sleep, consumption of ultra-processed foods, nutrient deficiencies, and so on. And so what is the role of refined seed oils in this? Are they heart healthy and good for you? Or are they a driver of the epidemic of chronic disease that we're seeing in Western countries in modern decades? Okay, so firstly we need to define what we mean by a seed oil. Seed oils are fats that are typically extracted from a seed, like sunflower seeds, canola seeds, soybeans, and so on, and are characterized by the high amounts of polyunsaturated fat, which is almost exclusively omega-6, and low amounts of saturated fat. Unsaturated fats have double bonds between carbon atoms, whereas saturated fats have only one single bond between carbons. The double bonds make polyunsaturated fats less chemically stable and also melt at a lower temperature. In order to produce a seed oil, the seeds are highly processed after collection, being pressed, ground and cooked, before solvent extraction with a solvent like hexane. The hexane being a health hazard is then removed, and the resulting oil then undergoes a series of refining processes to remove harmful components and make it more fit for human consumption. These steps are degumming, which chemically removes unwanted chemicals and particles, bleaching to remove some contaminants and lighten the colour of the oil, and deodorization to remove bad odours using high temperatures above 200 degrees C. The complicated and long processing required means that they're a very modern food when compared to animal fats or other oils from fruits like extra virgin olive oil, which can be extracted mechanically without use of heat or solvents. Indeed, at the beginning of the 1900s in countries like the UK and US, fats from animal sources like butter, lard and beef tallow dominated the dietary fats. These fats contained only small amounts of omega-6 or linoleic acid, but enough to prevent a deficiency. Omega-6 or linoleic acid, as well as omega-3 fats, are essential fats, which means that our bodies require them to function properly. We cannot make them, and so we must get them from our diet. Cottonseed oil was the original vegetable oil in America. Cotton seeds were an unwanted byproduct of cotton processing and were virtually worthless. Unrefined cottonseed oil is toxic with a foul smell and taste, so oil extracted from the seeds was originally only used as fuel in lamps or as lubricant for machinery. Due to improvements in the refining process, non-toxic and deodorized cottonseed oil could be made for cooking, with any bad tastes and smells removed. This allowed pure liquid cottonseed oil to be sold from 1900 onwards, although less refined cottonseed oil had also been used before this, to adulterate more expensive fats and oils, a similar practice to what was seen with bread in the Victorian era, with some bakers trying to bulk out the bread with hazardous materials like chalk or sawdust. However, the animal fats that people were accustomed to baking and cooking with were solid at room temperature, not liquid oils, and were more stable. This led to Procter & Gamble developing Crisco, which launched in 1911. Crisco, short for crystallized cottonseed oil, was a solid white fat made entirely by hydrogenating cottonseed oil, producing fats that were more saturated and giving it a similar appearance to lard. Crisco looked and felt similar to lard, while also being much cheaper. Combining these properties with a very extensive advertising campaign led to Crisco being a great success. The negative health effects from the artificial trans fats in Crisco would not be known until decades later. These days, other seed oils like soybean oil, sunflower oil, and canola oil are very widespread and can be found as ingredients in many products in supermarkets, and they have largely replaced animal fats thanks both to their lower price and recommendations to decrease saturated fat consumption. And so, is there any evidence that consumption of these seed oils is harmful? During millions of years of evolution, it is thought that our ancestors consumed omega-6 and omega-3 fats at a ratio of roughly 1:1. However, due to modern agriculture, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in Western diets is now closer to 20:1, a massive difference to the level seen in our evolution. And this is due to a decrease in omega-3 consumption combined with a large increase in omega-6. And this is not just due to consuming seed oils. Modern agriculture has also decreased the omega-3 content of many foods and increased the omega-6 content. The omega-3 and omega-6 content of foods like eggs, fish, and butter depends on the food the animals eat, with free-range chickens and wild fish having more omega-3 than barn chickens or farmed fish, and with grass-fed cows producing butter with higher omega-3 than ones consuming grains or leftovers from seed oil production. According to the author of 2 review articles, this large imbalance towards omega-6, combined with other diet and lifestyle factors like a lack of exercise, promotes blood clotting and inflammation, and contributes to heart disease, obesity, diabetes, arthritis, cancer, osteoporosis, mental health problems, dry eye disease, and age-related macular degeneration, and other related diseases. So the author is basically claiming that all the diseases of civilization, which are most diseases that are neither genetic nor caused by an infection, are actually caused in part by this large excess in omega-6 in the diet, and that this large excess is not consistent with our evolutionary history. Let's explore more where these claims come from. The human body cannot convert omega-6 to omega-3, and ingesting omega-3 from fish oils is seen to partially replace the omega-6 fats in the membranes of cells, which is important as omega-6 and omega-3 have opposing effects. Without getting too much into the biochemistry, linoleic acid is the precursor to arachidonic acid. High levels of linoleic acid and low levels of alpha-linolenic acid, which is its omega-3 counterpart, may lead to high levels of arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is a parent compound for inflammatory signaling molecules, and so high levels can lead to high chronic inflammation. High arachidonic acid levels also lead to insulin resistance, meaning your cells do not respond correctly to the hormone insulin, which is the start of diabetes and metabolic disease. High arachidonic acid levels also lead to leptin resistance. Leptin is the satiety hormone that makes you feel full after eating, and so this leads to overeating. Excess arachidonic acid is also thought to decrease fatty acid oxidation, your body's ability to burn fat, and decrease mitochondrial biogenesis, which decreases the number of mitochondria in your cells. Mitochondria being the powerhouse of your cells, which produce more than 90% of your cell's energy, and so omega-6 alters your cell's metabolism. There's also reason to believe that it causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Omega-3 fats, on the other hand, have opposing effects, reducing inflammation, improving insulin sensitivity, and increasing fat burning. High levels of arachidonic acid in fat tissue is also associated with obesity in children, whereas supplementation with omega-3 fats like EPA and DHA, as found in oily fish or fish oil, may be protective against obesity. In mouse models, a specific mouse breed called FAT1 has an enzyme that can convert omega-6 to omega-3. When fed a diet high in omega-6, these FAT1 mice are able to strongly resist obesity, diabetes, and other health problems that normal mice developed on the same diet. In human studies, omega-3 fat supplementation has been shown to reduce body weight and obesity. And in the NIH Women's Health Initiative study, a higher omega-6 content in red blood cell membranes was associated with increased weight gain, whereas a higher omega-3 content was associated with decreased weight gain. The omega-3 and omega-6 content of red blood cell membranes is thought to be a good indicator of your dietary intake. It's also noted in the meta-analysis from Christopher Ramsden that studies that only increased linoleic acid had worse health outcomes, but studies that increased omega-3 had better health outcomes. And so it looks like we have good evidence that upsetting the balance between omega-6 and omega-3 can lead to obesity, diabetes, and general inflammatory and metabolic disease. But upsetting the balance between omega-6 and omega-3 is not the only reason suggested against seed oils. A new theory of what causes heart disease is called the oxidized linoleic acid theory of coronary heart disease. And in the words of the authors, dietary linoleic acid, especially when consumed from refined omega-6 vegetable oils, gets incorporated into all blood lipoproteins such as LDL, VLDL, and HDL, increasing the susceptibility of all lipoproteins to oxidize, and hence increases cardiovascular risk. And so it is in fact these oxidized lipoproteins that are sometimes called cholesterol by doctors because they carry fats and cholesterol, that cause heart disease. And the way these lipoproteins become oxidized is due to linoleic acid. Because linoleic acid is a polyunsaturated fat, it is not very stable and is highly susceptible to reacting with oxygen. Saturated fats, on the other hand, are much more stable and can also be packed together more tightly, which is why our bodies use them for storing energy. And so this oxidized linoleic acid is what causes oxidation of the lipoprotein that is carrying it. This means that high levels of dietary linoleic acid, which is the main polyunsaturated fat consumed in Western diets, leads to high levels of oxidized lipoprotein, and the oxidation of the lipoprotein LDL changes the shape of its receptor, meaning that it is no longer recognized by the liver, and instead is recognized by the immune system. It is thought that this is then a recipe for cardiovascular disease and increased inflammation. But it's not only inside the body that linoleic acid can oxidize. Linoleic acid in seed oils can be freely oxidized before even reaching the inside of the body. Walnut oil was seen to readily oxidize when stored at 40 degrees C in a sealed container with air. And the same was seen for corn oil stored at room temperature, with longer storage times leading to an increase in oxidation products. The rate of formation of oxidation products from polyunsaturated fats increases with temperature. Some of the oxidation products are aldehydes, which are known carcinogens. Higher temperature cooking and higher polyunsaturated fat content has been seen to increase the production of toxic oxidation products, including aldehydes, with one study showing that cooking with sunflower oil, the most polyunsaturated oil tested, produced the most aldehydes, and palm oil, which was the most saturated oil tested, produced the lowest. And so polyunsaturated oils can contain harmful oxidation products before even being consumed, just by being stored in the presence of air. And this is made much worse by heating oil in cooking. The authors concluded that oils with low levels of unsaturated fats should be used in cooking to reduce the production of these harmful oxidation products like aldehydes, and only gentle cooking should be used for oils that are higher in unsaturated fats. This is also why it's recommended to store olive oil in a cool, dark place to stop it from going rancid due to oxidation. Now, we've seen that these oxidation products are likely a major driver of heart disease, but what other effects might the oxidation products of linoleic acid or its metabolites have? For this, we'll be looking at two recent review articles from 2023 and 2022. One of the most studied oxidation products is a chemical called 4-HNE, which is thought to have a role in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, as well as cancer, age-related macular degeneration, and hearing loss. 4-HNE is highly reactive, and along with other compounds created from oxidizing linoleic acid, is able to damage structures like DNA, cell membranes, proteins, mitochondria, and stem cells. These oxidation products can also cause mitochondrial dysfunction, abnormally high inflammation, impair immune function, as well as cause insulin resistance. Dysfunction of the mitochondria is thought to increase systemic oxidative stress, potentially increasing cancer risk. And in fact, according to the evidence presented in the review article, excess linoleic acid is thought not just to cause heart disease, but is also linked to cancer, diabetes, obesity, eye damage, autoimmune conditions, fatty liver disease, neurological conditions like Alzheimer's disease, anxiety, and depression. And has even been shown that your susceptibility to sunburn is directly influenced by the amount of linoleic acid in your diet, with increased linoleic acid leading to an increase in sunburn and skin cancer risk in mice. It is also thought that the negative impacts of excessive omega-6 consumption may progress through the generations. One study in mice fed a Western-like diet high in linoleic acid and low in omega-3. They found that over 4 generations, the Western-like diet gradually increased the body fat of the mice, despite the diets being otherwise perfectly matched in composition and identical in calories. And so excessive levels of omega-6 may cause minor issues for your health, but cause larger issues for the health of your children, and even larger for their children. Okay, so we've seen that there's good evidence that excessive omega-6 consumption might be harmful, and it contributes to many of the chronic diseases that are so prevalent in Western society today. But what is a normal level of omega-6? The current intake for omega-6 in the US is estimated at around 6 to 8% of daily calories on average, and the average concentration of linoleic acid in adipose tissue in the US has increased by approximately 2.5 times, going from 9.1% to 21.5% between 1959 and 2008. And today is likely even higher. But by 1959, people had already been consuming industrial seed oils for decades, and so we need to look at the fat levels of those on an ancestral diet. The Tokelau Pacific Islanders consumed roughly 2% of their diet as polyunsaturated fats, giving about 1% from omega-6, similar to estimates of Western consumption in the early 1800s, and the Tokelau had 3.8% linoleic acid in their adipose tissue, or their fat, much lower than we see in Western diets. And linoleic acid has a half-life of approximately 2 years. This is very concerning because unlike something like refined carbohydrates, which your body cannot store much of, it can take years to reduce your linoleic acid concentration to normal levels. Another thing to note is that vegetables are almost entirely deficient of vitamins and minerals when compared to animal fats, particularly fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, and so there isn't really any nutritional benefit to them beyond just their fat. And so to conclude, vegetable or seed oils are high in polyunsaturated fats, particularly omega-6 linoleic acid. Consumption of seed oil has led to a large increase in linoleic acid consumption, upsetting the balance of omega-6 and omega-3 in the diet, that throughout evolution had a roughly 1-to-1 ratio between them. And now in the modern Western diet, this is around a 20-to-1 ratio in favour of omega-6, completely different to our past evolutionary environment. And this change has happened in the past 150 years. The high amounts of linoleic acid and low amounts of omega-3 leads to increased inflammation, insulin resistance leading to elevated insulin levels, leptin resistance leading to overeating, and also decreases the body's ability to burn fat. Together, this is thought to lead to obesity and metabolic disease. Linoleic acid is also easily oxidized in storage, in cooking, and in the body, producing toxic compounds and damaging lipoproteins like low-density lipoprotein, as well as proteins, DNA, and mitochondria. This seems to lead to increasing inflammation, cardiovascular disease, metabolic diseases like obesity and diabetes, cancer, neurological problems, and neurodegenerative diseases, as well as autoimmune conditions, age-related macular degeneration, and other problems. And so it looks like there's good evidence that excessive linoleic acid consumption from seed oils is one of the main drivers of chronic disease in westernized countries. And so to wrap up, I think there's good evidence that seed oils are harmful to humans, and I think the best thing to do is to go back to getting our fats from animal fat and whole foods, which are much lower in polyunsaturated fat, just like we did before industrial seed oils were invented not so long ago. Fats from ruminants like cows and sheep in particular are less affected by their diet and are relatively low in omega-6. And we also need to make sure that we're getting enough omega-3 fats to keep those ratios balanced, because unfortunately modern agricultural practices seem to have reduced the omega-3 and increased the omega-6 in many foods. And above all else, polyunsaturated fats are not meant to be used as fuel for the body. They're meant to be consumed in much smaller amounts than other fats and carbohydrates, and instead have structural and signaling roles. And in many ways, this large increase in seed oil consumption over the last 150 years resembles one of the feeding experiments in mice, in which we, the consumers, are the mice, and the industrial food manufacturers are the experimenters, changing the composition of what we eat for their own profit, and observing the decline in health over time. If you liked the video and you learned something new, then do the usual YouTube stuff of liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing. And if you want to support the channel for more content like this, you can do so via PayPal or buy me a coffee, which will be linked in the description below.